The day Lena Vance turned 18, the state of Oregon handed her a cardboard box and called it a life. There was no cake, no candles, no one waiting in the parking lot with a sign that said her name. Just a box, a signature on a form she wasn't allowed to keep a copy of, and a caseworker named Ms. Whitmore, who had the particular kind of tired face that comes from delivering bad news so many times, it stops feeling like news at all. The fluorescent light above Miss Whitmore's desk flickered every few seconds, a nervous tic the building had developed over decades of hard use. And the office smelled like burnt coffee and old carpet, and the specific staleness of a room where difficult conversations happened every single day without resolution. Lena sat across from her with her hands folded in her lap, the way she had learned to sit in every office, every hearing room, every intake appointment for the past 12 years. Still, quiet, taking up as little space as possible. She had learned early that stillness was a kind of armor. If you didn't move, people tended to underestimate how much you were paying attention. And Lena had always been paying attention. Ms. Whitmore set a thick manila envelope on the desk between them and smoothed it flat with both palms, the way people do when they want to appear careful with something. "Before we go over your discharge paperwork," she said, "there's a matter of property." Lena looked at the envelope. "Your maternal grandfather, Arthur Vance, he passed away 11 years ago when you were 7. At the time, you were already a ward of the state, so the property he left behind was held in trust until you came of age." Ms. Whitmore paused. Today is that day. Lena had not thought about Arthur Vance in a long time. She had trained herself not to. The memory of him was the kind that hurt if you pressed on it, like a bruise that never fully healed. She remembered the smell of his flannel shirt, the way it combined sawdust and something like pine resin and plain soap into something that was entirely his own. She remembered his hands, always rough and warm at the same time, the hands of someone who had spent decades working with them. She remembered a story he used to tell her about a man who could read the weather just by watching the way the grass bent in the wind. She had been 6 years old the last time she saw him, standing in the doorway of a house she could no longer picture clearly, watching a car pull away with her in it. She remembered he didn't chase the car. She had decided at 6 years old that it meant he didn't want to. She had carried that decision for 12 years like a stone in her chest. "He left me something," Lena said. It wasn't a question. It was more like she was testing the shape of the words in her mouth. "He did." Ms. Whitmore opened the envelope and slid 2 things across the desk. A document, folded in thirds, brittle at the creases from years of sitting in a file. And a key. Old iron, dark with age, the kind of key that looked like it belonged to a door that might no longer exist. 5 acres of land in Harney County, eastern Oregon, about 300 miles from here. She hesitated. Rural, remote. The county assessor's office values the land at just over $2,000. There's a cabin on the property, but it's been unoccupied for over a decade, and the structural reports aren't encouraging. Lena reached out and picked up the key. It was heavier than it looked, cold in a way that the room didn't quite explain. "There's also an offer," Ms. Whitmore continued, and something in her voice shifted, the way a person's voice shifts when they're approaching the thing they've actually been building toward. She pulled another sheet from the envelope. "A company called Titan Industries has had a standing purchase offer on the property for the past 3 years. They've been acquiring land in that region. The offer is $5,000. Cash, clean transfer." She folded her hands on top of the paper. "Lena, I want to be straightforward with you. $5,000 is a real amount of money for someone in your position. It's a deposit on an apartment. It's time to find work, find your footing. The land itself has no practical value to you. No utilities, no road access to speak of, no agricultural potential. It's rock and scrub in a structure that's probably not safe to sleep in." Lena was still looking at the key. "Why does a company want to buy land with no practical value?" Ms. Whitmore blinked. "Developers often acquire land speculatively. They hold parcels, consolidate them, wait for zoning changes or infrastructure development. But they've had the offer open for 3 years," Lena said. "That's not speculative, that's patient. Those are 2 different things." Ms. Whitmore opened her mouth and then closed it again. In the silence, the fluorescent light above the desk flickered twice in quick succession. "I want to see it," Lena said. She watched Ms. Whitmore's expression do the thing faces do when a person has already made a decision but is still working out how to argue against it. The slight compression of the lips, the breath drawn in through the nose, the careful arrangement of concern over something that was actually closer to resignation. The discharge stipend is $200, Ms. Whitmore said finally. It's meant to cover immediate needs, food, transportation to a shelter, or transitional housing. If you spend it on a bus ticket to Harney County, you'll have very little left when you get there, and there may not even be adequate bus service to that area. There's a Greyhound to Burns, Lena said. From Burns, I can get a local connection to a town called Driftwood Flats. $32 each way. She paused. I looked it up at the library 3 days ago when I first found out about the property. Ms. Whitmore stared at her. I've had 12 years of practice making plans in offices like this one, Lena said. Not unkindly, just honestly. She signed the discharge paperwork. She took the deed and the key and the information about the Titan offer. She picked up her cardboard box, which contained 2 pairs of jeans, 4 shirts, a pair of boots that were almost the right size, her birth certificate, her social security card, and a photograph of a man she could barely remember, whose flannel shirt she could somehow still conjure if she concentrated. She walked out of the Oregon Department of Human Services on a gray Tuesday morning in March and stood on the sidewalk while the city moved around her, indifferent and enormous, and she thought about the way Ms. Whitmore had not been able to answer a simple question. Why does a company want land with no practical value? She bought the bus ticket. She spent $11 on food at a gas station. She kept the rest. The Greyhound left Portland at 7 in the morning. By the time it crossed the Cascade Range and the world outside the window changed from wet green to dry gold, Lena had stopped looking at her phone and started looking at the landscape. She hadn't spent much time east of the mountains. The group home she'd lived in for the last 4 years was in southeast Portland. Before that, a foster placement in Beaverton. Before that, one in Hillsborough. Before that, she'd stopped counting. All of it west of the mountains, all of it inside the same gray weather system, the same perpetual drizzle, the same sky that never quite committed to either rain or sun. Out here, the sky made a decision and stuck with it. It was blue in a way that felt almost aggressive, an unbroken reach of color from one edge of the horizon to the other, and the land underneath it was vast and flat and scoured-looking, as though something enormous had run its hand across it a very long time ago and smoothed away all the complications. Juniper trees dotted the hillsides in clusters. Rimrock formations jutted up from the valley floors like the exposed bones of something much older than anything Lena had a name for. She pressed her forehead against the cool glass of the window and thought about Arthur Vance and about the stone she had been carrying in her chest for 12 years, and whether it was possible to put a stone down after you had carried it long enough that you'd stop noticing the weight. She arrived in Burns in the early afternoon and stepped off the bus into a different kind of quiet than she was used to. City quiet was never actually quiet. It was layered noise with occasional gaps. This was something else entirely. A silence with real depth to it, the kind you could put your hand into. She stood on the depot platform with her cardboard box and her discharge stipend and looked at the mountains on the horizon and felt, for the first time in as long as she could remember, that the space around her was not confining her but simply existing alongside her. It was at the depot in Burns that she met Corbett. He was a large, weathered man with a quiet voice and a way of moving that suggested he had long since made his peace with unhurried. He drove a supply truck that ran routes to the smaller communities in the region, and he had been waiting on the same platform for a shipment when he noticed the deed in Lena's hand as she checked the address against a piece of paper. He asked if she was going out to the Vance property. She said yes. He was quiet for a moment, the kind of quiet that meant he was deciding something. Then he said, Arthur Vance was a good man, stubborn as a corner post, but good. He paused. He spent about 2 years fighting the state to keep you after your folks passed, hired 3 different lawyers. Last one cost him everything he had left in savings. Lost anyway. He looked at her with a directness that had nothing unkind in it. I don't know what they told you about why you ended up in the system, but it wasn't because he stopped trying, just so you know. Lena stood very still on the depot platform, holding her cardboard box, while something she had carried for 12 years shifted position in her chest. Not gone, just different. like a stone that had been in one spot so long it had left an impression, and when it moved, the impression remained. She said, "Thank you for telling me that." He offered her a ride out to the property. She accepted. The road from Driftwood Flats to the Vance property was a dirt track that hadn't seen regular maintenance in years. Corbett's truck moved slowly, working its way around the worst of the ruts, dust lifting in a pale curtain behind them. The landscape out here was different from the valley floor. Hillier, more fractured, the rock formations closer and more dramatic. Juniper giving way in places to sections of bare basalt that caught the afternoon sun and threw it back in flat sheets of orange and copper. Arthur used to come into town every few weeks for supplies, Corbett said, keeping his eyes on the track. Last few years of his life, he didn't come in as often. People figured he was getting reclusive. Looking back, I think he was just occupied. He shook his head slowly. Man was always digging something out on the back of his property. People in town thought he'd gone a little odd. But Arthur was never odd. He was intentional. Everything that man did was intentional. Lena thought about that word, intentional. Corbett slowed the truck and pointed. She looked, and for a moment she couldn't make herself say anything at all. The cabin was small, perhaps 400 square feet, and the roof had given way at the center, the ridgeline bowing downward in a shape that suggested it had been losing its argument with gravity for some considerable time. Two of the three windows were boarded over with plywood that had warped and split along the grain. The front porch had lost most of its railing, and what remained leaned at an angle. The remains of a barn sat to the left of the cabin, its wall standing on two sides and entirely collapsed on the other two, so it looked like a structure someone had tried to erase and then given up on partway through the job. Behind it all, rising up from the back of the property, was a hillside of solid rock. Pale gray basalt streaked with darker lines where minerals had concentrated over centuries, catching the late afternoon sun at an angle that made it look almost warm. It dominated the property the way a cathedral wall dominates the square in front of it, massive and permanent and old in a way that made the cabin's 50-odd years look like a recent and temporary intrusion on something that had been here a great deal longer. "This is as far as I can take you," Corbett said. He looked at her with that same quiet directness. "You sure about this?" "I'm sure," she said. She wasn't entirely, but she was sure she needed to be here, which felt close enough to count. She paid him the $10 he asked for and watched the truck turn around and work its way back down the track, the dust hanging in the still air long after the engine sound had faded into the larger silence. Then it was just her and the property and the enormous quiet of eastern Oregon in the late afternoon. She stood there for a while, looking at it all. The despair came in gradually, not all at once but by degrees, finding the thin places and settling into them. She was 18 years old, and she had $157 remaining, and this caved-in roof, this collapsed barn, this scrap of hard dry land at the end of a rutted track in the middle of nowhere, this was her inheritance. This was what 12 years of waiting had produced. Ms. Whitmore had been right. She had been right about all of it. Lena set her cardboard box on the ground, sat down on the bottom porch step, which groaned under her weight but held, and put her face in her hands. She did not cry easily. She had learned not to over years of practice in places where showing feeling was a kind of vulnerability that cost you. But out here, with no one watching, with 300 miles of Oregon between her and every eye that had ever assessed her or pitied her, or written observations about her in a file, she let herself cry. She cried for the life that had come apart before she was old enough to understand it was happening. She cried for the man in the flannel shirt who had apparently spent everything he had on lawyers and lost anyway. She cried because she had come all this way on a bus and spent money she couldn't afford to spend, and there was nothing here, and she was completely alone. After a while, the tears stopped. She wiped her face with the back of her hand and sat up and looked at the rock wall rising behind the ruined cabin. She thought about the key, not the old iron key, the one Ms. Whitmore had told her would open the cabin. She thought about the weight of it, heavier than it should have been for its size. She thought about what Corbett had said. Intentional. Everything that man did was intentional. An intentional man who had spent his last years digging. She picked up her box, went to the cabin door, and put the iron key in the lock. It turned with resistance, protesting years of disuse, and the door swung inward with a sound of complaint. The inside was a single room, low-ceilinged, thick with the smell of dust and something organic beneath it. mold, or simply the accumulated smell of time in an enclosed space. A table, a chair with a cracked leg, a cot whose mattress had been colonized by something small and industrious. Everything coated in the fine pale dust of Eastern Oregon, which had a quality of infiltrating every surface and staying indefinitely. She didn't linger. She set her box on the table, took the small flashlight she'd bought at the gas station in Burns out of her bag, and went back outside. She walked around the cabin to the back. The rock wall was closer than it had appeared from the front, and at its base, partially concealed by a sprawl of old juniper that had grown up against the stone over years of nobody cutting it back, was an opening. Not large, not dramatic, just a dark slot in the rock face, perhaps 5 feet high and 3 feet wide, exhaling a breath of cold air that was startlingly different from the dry warmth of the late afternoon outside. She stood at the entrance and looked in. The darkness inside was complete. She could hear something faintly, something she couldn't quite name. Not water exactly, more like the residual presence of water, a damp coldness, a stillness that had moisture in it. She switched on the flashlight. The beam entered the cave and kept going without returning. She pushed the juniper branches aside and stepped through. The entrance passage was narrow, perhaps 10 feet long, and then it opened into something larger. Her flashlight swept the walls and ceiling, and she stopped moving. The chamber was bigger than she had anticipated, perhaps 40 feet across, the ceiling rising into shadow beyond the reach of her light. The walls were smooth in some sections and rough in others, glistening with moisture at the lower levels. The floor was flat stone, worn even, the way stone becomes when water has moved across it for a very long time. Formations hung from the visible sections of ceiling, frozen in the act of forming, patient beyond any human scale of patience. It was cold, 50 degrees, maybe a little less. She moved the flashlight slowly around the space, and that was when she saw them. Marks on the wall near the entrance, not random but made with intention. Hash marks in groups of 5, the system a person uses when keeping count of something over time. Dozens of groups, hundreds of marks. She stepped closer and saw that beside the hash marks were words written in black marker that had faded but not disappeared. Survey Run 4, flow rate consistent, March 3rd. And beside that, Quality Test Sample 7, sent to Cascades Lab. And beside that, smaller, written in a different moment from a different emotional register. Still here, girl, still working. Lena stood very still for a long moment. Then she moved deeper into the cave. 2 more chambers lay beyond the first, connected by low passages she had to duck through. She followed the flashlight beam and the thread of marker notations on the walls, dates and measurements, and the occasional observation that read less like scientific record and more like a man thinking out loud in the dark. The second chamber was smaller and smelled strongly of minerals, something between iron and copper, and something else she had no name for. The third was the smallest of the 3, nearly circular, the ceiling low enough that she could have touched it on her toes. In the center of the third chamber was a footlocker, military surplus, the kind sold at Army/Navy stores for practical purposes. Dark green paint worn through to metal at every corner. A heavy-duty padlock, dull brass. And sitting on top of the footlocker, placed there with the precise care of someone who had thought carefully about being found, was a small tin box, the kind that once held butter cookies or Christmas candy. A strip of tape across the lid, and written on the tape in the same black marker she'd been following through the chambers. Lena, open this first. Her hands were shaking. She hadn't noticed them shaking, but they were, badly enough that she had to set the flashlight on the ground and angle it upward before she could manage the lid of the tin. Inside, resting on a fold of faded cotton batting, was a key. Brass, newer than anything else in this cave, clean and precise-edged. And beneath the key, folded in half, an envelope. Her name on the front in a shaky but purposeful hand, the same hand she had been following through the cave on the walls. She sat down on the cold stone floor with her back against the footlocker and opened the envelope. 3 pages inside, covered front and back in Arthur Vance's handwriting, small and careful, and slightly uneven in the way of someone who has written a great deal under physical difficulty, in bad light, in a cold place over a long span of time. She angled the flashlight and began to read. He started simply, the way people start letters they have been composing in their heads for years. My dear Lena, if you're reading this, it means 2 things. It means I'm gone. which I'm sorry for, more than I have the words to say. And it means you came. You didn't sell it. You didn't listen when they told you it was worthless. You got on whatever bus or truck or borrowed vehicle would carry you out here, and you came. I knew you would. You always had that in you, even as a very small girl. You couldn't let a question go unanswered. Your mother was exactly the same way. I need to tell you the truth about what happened. I need you to know it wasn't the way they told you. She stopped, drew a breath, started again. When your parents died, you were 6 years old, and I was the only family left. I wanted to keep you. God, Lena, there was nothing in the world I wanted more. But the county sent a social worker and then a supervisor and then a man from the state office. And they had their checklists. I was 63 years old with a fixed pension that barely covered my own costs. I had a house that needed repairs I hadn't been able to afford. By their measurements, by the numbers on their forms, I didn't meet the threshold. I hired a lawyer, then a second one, then a third. I spent 2 years fighting them, and every dollar I had and I lost anyway. They took you regardless, but I never stopped, Alina. Losing a legal fight isn't the same as giving up. It just means you have to find a different way to fight. She turned the page. This land, these 5 acres of rock and dry ground that they told you were worthless, have a secret. My father knew it. His father knew it before him. Under this hillside, running through this cave system, there is an underground spring. Clean, cold, deep, and consistent in a region that hasn't had reliable surface water in 60 years. In country this dry, water like this isn't merely valuable. It changes what becomes possible. What can be built, grown, sustained across generations. I spent 10 years mapping every part of this cave, taking measurements, having the water tested by an independent laboratory in Bend. I have the reports, the geological surveys, the water quality assessments, all of it documented and verified, all of it in the footlocker. The brass key opens it. There is also money to help you get started. $10,000. I saved it over a long time in small amounts, the way you save when there isn't much to save from. Use it carefully. Fix the cabin first. Make the place livable. Then read my journals, which are in the footlocker. They will teach you everything I learned about what you are standing on. The company that has been trying to buy your land, Titan Industries, knows something is here. They don't know exactly what. They can sense the value without being able to locate it precisely. That is why they have been patient. Patient money isn't speculative money. Patient money is strategic. Don't sell to them. Whatever they offer, don't sell. The last page. There are 3 keys, Lena. The first, open the cabin. The second will open this footlocker. The third is not something you can hold in your hand. You will understand what it is when you are ready for it. I love you. I have loved you every single day of the 12 years I could not reach you. I have talked to you in this cave where no one could hear me and told you things I could never say any other way. I am more proud of you than I have language for, and I haven't even seen what you are going to do yet. I just know. That stubbornness, that refusal to leave a question unanswered. You got on the bus. That is everything I needed to know. All my love, your grandfather, Arthur. Lena sat on the cold stone floor of the deepest chamber of a cave in eastern Oregon, 300 miles from the city that had processed her childhood into paperwork, and she held the 3 pages of her grandfather's handwriting against her chest. And she did not cry this time. She had already cried outside, over the wrong thing. She sat there for a long time. The flashlight beam held steady on the ceiling above her, and the silence of this place was a different kind of silence from the one she had felt standing in front of the ruined cabin. That had been an empty silence. This was the silence of a place where someone had worked for a very long time, in the cold and the dark, without acknowledgement, without anyone knowing, for a specific and singular purpose. For her. She thought about what 10 years actually meant. The time it takes a child to grow from 6 to 16. The time it takes a pension to accumulate $10,000 in careful increments. The time it takes a man in his 60s to teach himself hydrology from used books, to map a cave system alone with a flashlight, to send water samples to a laboratory in Bend, and wait for results that would tell him whether the thing he was building for his granddaughter was real. She thought about the words, "Still here, girl," "Still working," written on the cave wall in faded black marker next to a date from 8 years ago. She thought about this question Ms. Whitmore had not been able to answer. She reached down and picked up the brass key. It turned in the padlock with a clean, solid click, nothing like the resistance of the old iron key in the cabin door. This one had been maintained, oiled and checked and kept ready for the day someone would need it. The first thing she saw when she lifted the lid was the journal. Thick leather cover, pages dense with Arthur's handwriting, denser and more technical than the letter but broken through with personal observations of the kind a person makes when they have been alone long enough that the journal becomes a form of company. She lifted it out carefully. Beneath it were the documents, survey reports with technical language and precise measurements, geological assessments with diagrams she didn't yet know how to read, water quality analyses on the letterhead of the Cascades Environmental Testing Laboratory in Bend, dated over a span of 7 years. She didn't understand all of it. Not yet. But she understood some of the words that appeared across multiple pages in consistent type. Potable, consistent, abundant, viable. She understood those words. Beneath the documents, a waterproof bag. She opened it and counted the bills in the flashlight beam. $10,000 exactly in mixed denominations, assembled over years in the patient way of someone who did not have the luxury of large amounts at once. Another bag. Photographs. Her parents on their wedding day, both of them young and bright-eyed and entirely unaware of what was coming. Herself at 2 years old, held in Arthur's arms, both of them squinting into summer sun. Herself at 4, standing on a porch she didn't recognize, holding a fishing rod too big for her with an expression of total concentration. Herself at 6, gap-toothed, grinning at something outside the frame. He had kept every photograph that existed of her from before the system took her. For 11 years, he had kept them in a waterproof bag and a locked footlocker in the deepest chamber of a cave in eastern Oregon. There was also a small silver locket. On one side, Arthur and a woman who must have been her grandmother, both much younger, standing in front of the cabin when it still had a whole roof and a standing porch. On the other side, the photograph of Lena at 4 with the fishing rod. He had kept her face close to him, for however many years he had left after they took her away. The last item in the footlocker was a sealed envelope, thick with documents inside, addressed to a law office in Burns. She didn't open it. The letter had told her what it contained. A retainer paid years ago, instructions prepared over time, everything needed to begin a legal fight that Arthur had known was coming and had decided in advance to win. She sat back on her heels and looked at everything spread across the cave floor in the flashlight beam. The journal, the surveys, the photographs, the money, the locket, the envelope for the lawyers. A man had built this, quietly alone, over more than a decade, in the cold of this cave with a flashlight not so different from the $3 one she was holding now. He had built it entirely for her. He had believed, without any guarantee and without any way of knowing, that she would come. She packed everything carefully back into the footlocker, except for the journal and the photographs and the locket, which she put in her jacket pockets. She left the footlocker unlocked, the brass key in the open padlock. She picked up her flashlight and stood. Then she read the letter one more time, the last section. 3 keys. The third one you cannot hold. She didn't understand it yet, but she believed she would. She was beginning to understand that Arthur Vance had been right about a great many things that other people had dismissed without examination. She made her way back through the low connecting passages, ducking through the joints between chambers, following the flashlight beam past the dated notations on the walls and the careful measurements and the words that she suspected she would return to for the rest of her life. Still here, girl. Still working. She came out through the entrance into the cold of an eastern Oregon evening and stood for a moment simply breathing the outside air, dry and sharp with juniper and something mineral beneath. The sky above the property was the kind of sky that city light erases. Stars from horizon to horizon, the Milky Way visible not as a suggestion, but as an actual structure, a sweep of concentrated light that you could navigate by. Arthur had stood here, she thought. He had stood in this exact spot under this exact sky and looked at this property and seen something that everyone else had been telling him for years was worthless. He had seen it so clearly that he spent 10 years making it undeniable. She went back inside the cabin. She moved the rotted mattress off the cot and set it outside. She hung her jacket over the broken window to block the wind. She sat down on the bare cot with Arthur's journal in her lap and opened it to the first page. and in the beam of her flashlight she began to read. The first entry was 2 sentences, written 12 years ago, the year she had been taken. They took her today. I am going to make sure she has something to come back to. She read until the flashlight batteries began to dim. Then she closed the journal, folded her hands on its cover, and in the cold dark of the cabin Arthur Vance had built and she had inherited, Lena Vance slept. The first morning on the property, she woke before sunrise. She lay still on the bare cot for a moment, listening to the quality of the silence. In the group home in Portland, there had always been noise, the building producing its own ambient sound around you, pipes and footsteps and the muffled intrusion of other people's televisions. Out here, there was nothing of that kind, just the pre-dawn stillness of eastern Oregon, so complete it had a texture to it, something you could feel against your skin. She got up and went outside. The sky was the deep blue-black that comes just before color returns to the world, and the temperature had dropped overnight to something close to freezing. Her breath made small clouds in the air. The property looked different in this light, less defeated somehow, the ruined cabin and the collapsed barn reduced to shapes rather than failures, and the rock wall behind everything rising enormous and pale against the remnants of the night sky. She stood on the broken porch and held Arthur's journal against her chest and thought about what came next. By the time the sun cleared the eastern rim of the valley, she had a list. First, the roof. Without a weather-tight roof, nothing else was possible. Second, the floor, which she had checked in 3 places and found soft with rot. Third, the windows. Fourth, whatever presented itself after that, which she would determine when she reached it. She walked the 5 miles into Driftwood Flats on the dirt track, arriving at the small cluster of buildings that constituted the town a little before 8 in the morning. A gas station, a diner, a hardware and general supply store, and a post office the size of a generously appointed closet. The surrounding population, she would learn, was somewhere around 300 people spread across a territory that in some eastern states would have been its own county. The man behind the counter at the hardware store was named Arlo Pruitt, mid-50s with the build that comes from decades of actual physical labor, broad through the shoulders and economical in every movement. A gray beard kept close, eyes that assessed things quickly and without unnecessary comment. He looked at Lena the way Corbett had looked at her at the depot, not with pity, but with the specific attention of someone who has learned to read situations accurately. She explained what she needed. He walked the aisles with her, asking precise questions about the roof span and the wall construction and whether the foundation was poured concrete or stone, and she answered as accurately as she could from what she'd observed. When they were done, he wrote figures on a pad and showed her the total, and she looked at it without flinching, though it was more than a third of everything she had. "You're Arthur's granddaughter," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes," she said. He looked at the total on the pad for a moment. "I can do the roof myself. Have a cousin who helps when I need a second set of hands. Materials and labor, 2 weeks if the weather cooperates." He paused. "Arthur fixed my father's fence 3 separate times over the years and never asked for anything for it. That's just information." "I'll pay for the materials, and I'll pay your labor," Lena said. "I just need to do it in stages." Arlo nodded once, slowly. "That's fair." They worked out a schedule. She counted bills from the waterproof bag in the footlocker that morning, doing the arithmetic twice to make sure she kept enough in reserve. On her way back to the property, she stopped at the diner and spent $4 on a bowl of soup and asked the woman behind the counter, whose name was Della, and who had the air of someone who had worked this particular counter long enough to have heard most things at least twice, whether Arthur had come in often. Della set the soup down and leaned against the counter. "Every 2 or 3 weeks for years. More when he was younger, less toward the end. He'd sit right there," she nodded at the stool at the far end of the counter, "and have the Tuesday special and read whatever book he was working through. Never talk much unless you started it. But if you asked him something, he gave you a real answer, not the polite kind." She paused. "Toward the end, he asked me once if there was any way to find out how a child in the state system was doing, whether they were all right. I didn't know the answer. I don't think there was one." Lena ate her soup and thanked her and walked back to the property. She spent that afternoon reading the journal. The entries that followed the first 2 sentences were technical at first. The observations of a man teaching himself a subject from scratch. He had bought books on hydrology and geology from a used bookstore in Burns, she gathered, because he referenced them by title, and he copied relevant passages into the journal in his own words, the way a careful student does when they need to understand something rather than simply remember it. He wrote about the cave system, about his first explorations of it, about his growing understanding of what the spring represented. He wrote about sending water samples to the laboratory in Bend using money he'd saved from his pension, packaging the samples to look like routine private well testing so there would be no commercial record to attract attention from anyone watching. He wrote about watching the land dry up around him over the years, the creek to the north that had run all summer when he was young and now ran only in early spring, the ranchers in the valley sinking deeper and deeper wells, the conversations in driftwood flats about water tables and aquifer depletion, the quiet, persistent anxiety of a community watching something essential diminish without knowing how to stop it. He wrote, "Nobody knows what is under this hillside. If they knew, it would be gone before I could protect it. I have to be careful about who knows what and when." Lena read for hours. Outside, she could hear Arlo arriving in his truck, beginning the preliminary work on the roof, moving across the structure above her with a measured, purposeful weight that was unexpectedly reassuring. She came to an entry from 3 years into the journal that made her set the book down on her knees and simply sit for a moment. Man came today from a company called Titan Industries. Name of Graydon. Suit, rental car, practice manner. Said they were interested in the property for regional development purposes. Offered $50,000. I told him the property was not for sale. He said he understood and that they would be glad to revisit the conversation if my circumstances changed. The way he said circumstances made it sound like something that could be arranged by outside parties. She read the entry dated 3 days later. Graydon came back, less smooth this time. He mentioned the county's assessment of the cabin's structural integrity and how that might develop into a code enforcement matter. He talked about how the access road technically crosses a corner of land that Titan recently acquired, which could complicate future legal access. Then, almost as a passing observation, he said that old men living alone in remote locations had a habit of encountering difficulties. He said it the way you mentioned the weather. I went inside after he left and retrieved the tape recorder. I am going to keep it charged. I am going to be very careful from here. Lena sat very still on the cot. She set the journal down carefully and went to the footlocker. She went through it methodically, item by item, until she found what she was looking for at the bottom beneath the stacked document folders. A cassette recorder, old but solid, the kind used by journalists and lawyers and people who needed documentation more than convenience. And beside it, a cassette tape in a plastic case, labeled in Arthur's handwriting. Bird Songs, June. She held it in both hands and looked at it for a long time. Then she put it back, precisely where she had found it. She went back to the journal and kept reading. Arlo came in after another hour to give her his structural assessment. New rafters on the east section, full resheathing, new metal roofing panels. 2 weeks if the weather held. She told him to begin as soon as materials arrived. She watched him return to his truck and thought about what an intentional person looked like from the outside, taking measurements, noting angles, planning the sequence of work. Arthur had been that. Arlo was that. She was going to have to learn it herself. The days that followed had the specific quality of hard physical work, which has a way of filling time so completely that thought becomes a secondary activity occurring in the background while the body does what is needed. While Arlo and his cousin worked on the roof overhead, Lena worked on the property. She hauled debris from the collapsed barn, sorting salvageable lumber from what needed to go. She pulled years of overgrowth from around the cabin's foundation, uncovering the stone footings, which turned out to be solid, better than anything above them. She cleared the path to the cave entrance, trimming back the juniper that had grown across it over years of neglect, keeping the opening accessible but not obvious to anyone who wasn't looking for it. In the evenings, she sat on the bare cot and read the journal and slowly began to understand the full scope of what Arthur had spent a decade building. The cave system was deeper than her initial explorations had reached. Arthur's maps showed 3 primary chambers and 2 secondary ones, all connected to a central underground spring emerging from a fault in the basalt at a depth of approximately 60 feet below the surface. The spring ran year-round, fed by snowmelt from mountains 20 miles north that percolated through volcanic rock over decades before emerging here. Clean and cold and entirely unaffected by the surface conditions that were drying out everything else in the basin. The flow rate Arthur had measured across 7 years was consistent enough to supply a small town's needs through a dry summer. The water quality results from the laboratory in Bend showed it was cleaner than most municipal sources in the state. And the geological survey he had commissioned anonymously confirmed that the spring was not a small isolated feature. It was the surface expression of a much larger aquifer system extending beneath most of the valley floor. The valley that Titan Industries had been quietly acquiring for 15 years. She found that in the document folders. Not Arthur's research, but Titan's, or a copy of something that had been Titan's. A set of internal planning documents dated 14 years ago, before Arthur had begun his own surveys. She read them slowly, twice, to make sure she understood what she was reading. Titan had commissioned their own geological survey of the Harney County Basin 14 years ago. The results had identified several potential aquifer access points across the region. The Vance property was marked on their map with a red circle and a notation in small type. Priority acquisition, highest probability zone. Arthur had obtained a copy of these documents. He hadn't written in the journal how. He had simply inserted them into the folder with a single handwritten note attached. They knew before I started digging. They have known the whole time. Lena sat with that for a long time. They hadn't been patient because they were uncertain. They had been patient because they were certain, waiting systematically and without urgency for the old man on the priority acquisition property to die or surrender or exhaust his resources, whichever came first. And they had tried to accelerate the process when he proved more resistant than they had anticipated. Old men living alone in remote locations had a habit of encountering difficulties. She put the documents back in the folder and went outside and stood in the evening air, looking at the property as the sun went down behind the western rim of the valley. The light going orange and then deep red, and then the particular dark pink that eastern Oregon produces in the last minutes of a clear day, a color that looked painted rather than natural. She thought about Graydon, the name in Arthur's journal, the suit, the rental car, the practiced smoothness that gave way to something harder when the smoothness produced no result. On the 12th day after her arrival, a black SUV came down the dirt track and parked in front of the cabin. The man who stepped out was perhaps 60, with the compact, maintained look of someone who had spent a lifetime in temperature-controlled environments and had learned to navigate ones that weren't without showing inconvenience. Silver hair, precisely cut. A suit that cost more than the entire contents of Arthur's waterproof money bag. He moved across the rutted ground with the careful precision of someone used to better surfaces, but too experienced to let that register visibly. Arlo stopped working on the roof and watched. The man surveyed the new roofing panels going up. He took in the cleared foundation, the path to the cave entrance, the evidence of 2 weeks of active work. He looked at all of it with the eyes of someone who had expected to find abandonment and found something that complicated his calculations. Then he looked at Lena. She was standing in the cabin doorway. She had been pulling rotted floorboards all morning and was covered in dust and had a pry bar in her right hand. She was 18 years old and she looked exactly like what she was. A young woman doing difficult physical work in the high desert sun, with no resources to speak of and no particular leverage. He looked at her the way people look at something they have assessed and found manageable. "Miss Vance," he said. His voice was measured and pleasant, a voice accustomed to setting the temperature of a room. "My name is Graydon. I'm with Titan Industries. I believe your caseworker communicated our interest in the property to you before you took possession." "She did," Lena said. "We were sorry to hear you decided not to accept the offer. We thought it might be worth a conversation in person." He glanced at the roof work, at Arlo watching from above. "It looks like you've been investing in the property. That's admirable. I'd want to make sure you understood the full financial picture before committing too deeply." He walked closer, stopping perhaps 6 feet from the porch. Up close, his face was composed, but his eyes were doing something separate from his voice, moving across her with a calculation that had nothing warm in it. "The offer was $5,000, he said. "Given the investment you've already made, we'd be willing to go to 15. That's a meaningful number for someone in your position." A precisely timed pause. "You've been in the state system your entire life, if I understand correctly. No family network, no employment history, no credit. $15,000 is a genuine foundation. This property, on the other hand, is an ongoing financial liability. The repairs will consume whatever you have, and then you'll have a functional cabin on land with no agricultural or commercial value. We'd be doing you a favor. Lena looked at him, at the suit, at the silver hair, at the eyes conducting their separate, cooler work. You drove out here yourself, she said. You didn't send someone. You came personally to speak with an 18-year-old with a pry bar. She tilted her head slightly. How far is your office from Driftwood Flats? Something moved briefly behind his eyes. Portland, he said. That's 4.5 hours each way, she said. 9 hours of driving for a conversation about a property you've been characterizing as worth $5,000 for the past 3 years. She leaned the pry bar against the doorframe. My grandfather told me that patient money isn't speculative money. Patient money is strategic. I've been thinking about that distinction. Graydon's expression didn't change exactly, but its quality did. The pleasantness thinned, and beneath it was something older and less accommodating. Miss Vance, he said, I'm going to be direct with you since I think you'd prefer that. He reached into his jacket pocket and produced an envelope, which he set on the porch railing. Inside is a check for $15,000 and a brief legal document. The document concerns an adverse water claim that Titan Industries filed on the parcel adjacent to this property 13 years ago. Under Oregon water law, once a competing water claim has been filed, the holder of the primary property has 45 days from the date of inheritance to file a formal objection. After that window closes, the claim defaults to the filing party. He paused. You took possession of this property 17 days ago. You have 28 days remaining to file an objection. If you don't, whatever water rights might be associated with this property transfer to Titan's claim by operation of law. The land remains yours, of course, but what lies beneath it will not. Another pause. $15,000 is a fair offer for land without water rights. Actually, it's generous. The property had gone entirely quiet except for the wind moving through the junipers and, on the roof, the complete silence of Arlo Pruitt no longer working. Lena kept her eyes on Graydon. I'll think about it, she said. He nodded once, with the controlled satisfaction of a man who believes a conversation has landed where he intended. He walked back to the SUV, paused at the door. The window doesn't extend, Miss Vance. 28 days. He got in and drove back down the dirt track, the dust rising behind him and hanging in the still afternoon air. Lena listened to the engine sound diminish and disappear. Arlo climbed down from the roof and stood in the yard looking at where the SUV had been. Then he looked at Lena. Your grandfather had a visit from that man, he said, or someone very much like him, years back. He came into the hardware store the next day to buy a tape recorder. I know, Lena said. She picked up the envelope from the railing. She didn't open it. She carried it inside and set it on the table next to the footlocker. Then she went to the footlocker and took out the cassette recorder and the tape labeled Bird Songs, June, and set them beside the envelope. She sat on the cot and picked up the journal and found the page she had marked earlier, the one with the address of the law office in Burns. She read it twice to be certain she had the details right. The following morning she borrowed Arlo's truck, which he offered without being asked, handing her the keys the previous evening with the directness of someone who had made a decision and didn't require discussion about it. She drove the 40 miles to Burns on the empty early morning highway, the desert spreading flat on both sides in the gray light before full dawn. The law office of Harlan and Oates occupied the ground floor of a building on Burns Main Street that had been constructed in the 1940s and maintained in the way that things get maintained in small western towns, practically and without sentiment, replacing what wore out and leaving everything that still functioned alone. The office opened at 8. Lena was on the front step at 7:45. The woman who unlocked the door at 8 precisely was perhaps 60, with gray hair pulled back severely and reading glasses on a chain, and the bearing of someone who had been underestimated professionally for decades and had found it useful. She looked at Lena on her step without particular surprise. Miss Vance, she said. Not a question. Ms. Oates, Lena said. You were expecting me? Your grandfather told me to expect you at some point. He wasn't specific about timing. She held the door open. Come in. The office was orderly in the way of places where real work happens consistently, things where they needed to be rather than where they looked appropriate. Oates made coffee without asking if Lena wanted any and set a mug in front of her and put on her reading glasses and looked at Lena across the desk. Show me what you've brought, she said. Lena set the document folders on the desk. The geological surveys, the water quality reports, the Titan internal planning documents with the red circle and the notation, the journal, the cassette recorder, and the tape. Oates went through everything methodically and without comment. She read the surveys, she read the water reports, she read the Titan internal documents with no change of expression except a slight tightening around her eyes at the red circle on the map. She held the cassette recorder to her ear and listened to 30 seconds of the tape through the small built-in speaker, then set it down precisely. She removed her reading glasses and looked at Lena. Your grandfather was an exceptionally thorough man, she said. I'm beginning to understand that, Lena said. He retained this office 12 years ago. He said he was preparing for a legal action that his granddaughter might need to bring at some point after reaching majority. He paid a retainer he couldn't comfortably afford. He sent updated documents by mail every year or so. She paused. What's in this file, combined with what you've brought today, is a strong case. Not a certain case, because no case is certain, but a strong one. The adverse water claim Titan filed is procedurally valid, which means you do have to respond within the window. But your grandfather anticipated that, which is why the water rights documentation he built is so thorough. He was constructing a counterclaim, not merely a defense. 28 days, Lena said. 26, counting today. Oates picked up the Titan internal document. This piece I wasn't expecting. How did Arthur obtain this? He didn't write that in the journal. No. She set it down. He was wise not to, but it existed, which means someone inside Titan provided it to him, which means Titan has an internal documentation problem they are not currently aware of. She looked at Lena over her glasses. I need you to understand something. I can file the objection and manage the legal process. What I cannot do is make your decisions. Filing will trigger a response from Titan. They will escalate. They have resources. This will not be resolved in 26 days. It will take months. I understand, Lena said. Do you have somewhere to live while this proceeds? The cabin. Arlo Pruitt is repairing the roof. Oates regarded her with the evaluating attention of someone taking a careful reading. Arthur said you were stubborn, she said finally. He was right, Lena said. Yes. A brief pause. He generally was. She pulled a legal pad toward her. Tell me everything about the visit from Graydon. Every word you can recall, Lena told her. She had been running the conversation back through her memory since it happened, with the precision that comes from paying careful attention to every word spoken in situations that matter. Oates wrote steadily, asking occasional questions, her pen moving with the efficiency of someone who had been doing this work for a long time and had stopped wasting motion. When Lena finished, Oates set down her pen. The reference to the legal window was designed to pressure you into accepting before you had time to understand your options, she said. It's a standard approach. What's less standard is that Graydon came personally. Senior executives don't make personal visits to apply standard pressure. It suggests they consider this property significantly more urgent than their patience toward Arthur would indicate. They've been patient for 3 years, Lena said, but Arthur is gone now. They thought the obstacle had been removed. And instead they found you, Oates said. She filed the formal objection to Titan's water claim that afternoon. Lena sat in the office and read deeper into Arthur's journal while Oates worked, moving through the later entries, the ones from the last 2 years of his life. The handwriting was slightly more effortful in these sections, the letters larger and made more slowly, but the observations were as precise as ever. He wrote about the cave the way someone writes about a place they love, attending to small specific things. The way a particular crack in the ceiling of the first chamber let in a slant of winter light on certain mornings. The sound the spring made deep in the rock, below the threshold of hearing, but present as a sensation. The mineral formations in the secondary chambers that had been growing in the dark for centuries. He wrote in the second-to-last entry, I don't know how much longer I have. The doctors are honest about not knowing, which I respect. I am not afraid of it. I am only afraid of running out of time before everything is in place. But I believe it is. I believe it's all there. The rest belongs to Lena. She closed the journal carefully when she was done and sat looking at its cover. The rest belongs to Lena. She drove back to their property in the late afternoon, the sun angling flat across the desert, the shadows of the junipers running long and precise eastward on the pale ground. She stopped at the diner and ordered the Tuesday special, the same one Arthur used to order, which turned out to be beef stew with cornbread. And she sat on the stool at the far end of the counter where Della said he always sat. And she thought about what came next. That evening, she sat on the porch that Arlo had begun framing out, the first phase of the structural work nearly complete. The roof was weather-tight now. The inside of the cabin smelled of new lumber and fresh air instead of rot. The floor joists were next, then the windows. The neighbors had begun coming by, not intrusively, but with the quiet consistency of people in a small community registering that something had changed. A woman from the next property who left a paper bag of apples on the step without knocking. A man named Prescott, who had ranched the same land his grandfather had homesteaded, who stopped to introduce himself and stayed for an hour, talking about the water table and what its continued decline meant for operations that had been in families for 4 generations. He talked about it the way a doctor describes a patient he has been watching deteriorate over years, with specificity and with the measured grief of someone who has accepted the trajectory without accepting helplessness. Corbett had stopped by twice. Arlo had mentioned the visit from Graydon to someone, not as gossip, but as information of the kind that mattered in places where people's lives were genuinely interconnected. The SUV on the dirt track, the suit, the envelope on the porch railing. Nobody said much about it directly, but nobody left quickly either. Lena sat on the unfinished porch in the cooling evening and thought about Arthur alone here for 12 years, doing what he did in the cave, talking to her in the dark, keeping the recorder charged and the documents current and the retainer paid. She thought about what it cost a person to sustain something for that long in secret, with no acknowledgement, with no way of knowing whether the person it was for would ever actually come. She reached into her jacket pocket and her hand closed around the cassette tape. Bird Songs, June. She had not listened to it all the way through yet. She had been waiting, though she couldn't have explained the exact logic of waiting, some sense of needing to understand enough of the surrounding story before encountering the center of it. Inside the cabin, through the new window glass Arlo had installed that afternoon, light from the single lamp she'd set up fell across the table where Arthur's maps were spread. She had been learning the cave system chamber by chamber, the way Arthur had learned it, with his journals as a guide, with patience and attention and no particular hurry. She held the tape in her hand and sat on the porch in the dark while the stars came out above the property. The same vast, unobstructed sky Arthur had sat under for 12 years, and somewhere deep in the rock beneath her feet, consistent and quiet and entirely invisible to anyone who hadn't been told to look. The spring moved on through the dark in its own old patient way. She thought, he left me the question and he left me the answer. All she had to do was be ready to use it. The hearing was scheduled for a Tuesday morning in the second week of November, 41 days after Lena had walked out of the Oregon Department of Human Services with a cardboard box and a rusted key. The Harney County Courthouse was a 2-story brick building on the main street of Burns that had been standing since 1942 and had the appearance of something that intended to continue standing for a good while longer. It had the particular solidity of public buildings constructed in an era when permanence was considered a form of civic responsibility. The courtroom on the second floor was small by most standards, perhaps 40 seats in the gallery, a judge's bench of dark wood, 2 counsel tables, and windows that looked out over the street where the November morning was pale and cold and the mountains to the north carried their first real accumulation of early snow. Lena arrived an hour early and sat in the gallery and looked at the room. She thought about Arthur. He had never been in a room like this one. His fight had been in administrative offices, in social workers' waiting areas, in the low-ceilinged spaces that smell of institutional carpet cleaner and decisions already made. He had fought in the rooms where the outcomes were determined before they reached courtrooms, and he had lost there, and so he had changed his approach entirely. He had stopped trying to fight the system that had taken her and started building something the system couldn't reach. She had his journal in her bag, she had the cassette recorder, she had the document folders. She had spent the previous 3 weeks reading everything in the footlocker until she understood it as well as she understood anything, which was the only kind of preparation she knew how to do. Oates arrived at 8:30 with 2 associates carrying boxes of organized documents. She sat beside Lena and went through the structure of the morning in a quiet, precise voice. The sequence of evidence, what Titan's lawyers would likely argue, why those arguments were insufficient. "I'll be presenting the legal materials," Oates said, "but I want you ready to speak, specifically about the tape. When we reach that point, I want you to be the one who introduces it. You explain what it is and where it came from. The chain of custody runs through you. Beyond that, I also want you to present the geological maps directly to the court. You've spent 6 weeks in that cave. You understand those maps in a way that a lawyer reading them cannot convey. I understand, Lena said. How are you? Lena considered. Ready, she said. Oates looked at her for a moment with the careful attention she had brought to every conversation they'd had over the past weeks. Yes, she said. I think you are. The gallery filled in a way Lena had not anticipated. She had thought of this as a procedural matter between two parties and a judge in a small county courtroom. She had not expected that the people of Driftwood Flats and the surrounding valley would drive 40 miles to Burns on a Tuesday morning to fill those 40 seats. But they came. Corbett was there in a clean flannel shirt that was clearly his version of formal dress. Della from the diner. Prescott and his wife and 3 other ranching families Lena recognized from visits to the property over the past weeks. Arlo Pruitt sat in the second row with his arms crossed and his jaw set in the expression of someone who had already determined the outcome and was present to confirm it. On the other side of the courtroom, Titan's legal team was 3 lawyers in suits that made everything around them look temporary and improvised. 2 bankers' boxes of documents, the bearing of people accustomed to these rooms behaving predictably. Graydon sat behind the Titan lawyers in the front row of the gallery, in the same kind of suit he'd worn to the property. And when Lena came in, he looked at her with an expression that was precisely neutral in a way that required visible maintenance. She looked at him briefly and sat at the counsel table. The judge was a woman named Hargrove, in her 60s, with close-cropped white hair and the particular manner of someone who has presided over enough proceedings to have stopped being impressed by any of them. She came in without ceremony, sat, looked at the room, and began. Titan's lead lawyer was named Pellerin. Compact, precise, fluent, the kind of advocate who delivers arguments with the ease of someone who has refined the same essential structure many times. Titan Industries had filed a valid adverse water claim on the adjacent parcel 13 years ago, in full compliance with Oregon water law. The claim had been properly recorded with the state. The objection window had elapsed without challenge at the time. The current objection was procedurally untimely. He spoke for 20 minutes. The argument was clean and the citations were in order, and it had the quality of something engineered to sound inevitable. Then Oates stood up. She presented Arthur's geological surveys first, establishing the spring's existence and characteristics with methodical precision. She called a geologist from the University of Oregon who had reviewed Arthur's work, a man who had spent 30 years studying basin hydrology, and he testified for 40 minutes in language that left no reasonable room for disagreement. Pellerin objected to the relevance of the geological evidence twice. Hargrove overruled him both times. Then Oates nodded to Lena. Lena stood. She approached the evidence table where Arthur's maps had been laid out and turned to face the judge directly. She was 18 years old and had been doing hard physical labor in the eastern Oregon sun for 6 weeks, and she looked exactly like what she was, which was someone who had been living on and inside this land and had learned what it contained. Your Honor, she said, I'd like to walk the court through these maps, if I may. I've spent 6 weeks in the cave system my grandfather documented. I can explain what these measurements mean in terms that don't require a geology degree. Hargrove looked at her for a moment. Proceed, Miss Vance. Lena walked the court through the maps the way Arthur had taught her to understand them, not with legal language or scientific jargon, but with the specific language of someone who had been in the chambers themselves. She pointed to the flow measurements and explained what they meant in practical terms for a valley that had been watching its wells drop for 30 years. She showed the cross-section diagram and described where each chamber sat in relation to the surface. She talked about the spring the way someone talks about something they have spent time with specificity and with the ease of real familiarity. When she finished, the courtroom was quiet with the specific quality of people who have understood something new. Pellerin objected on relevance grounds. Hargrove denied it without elaboration. Then Oates presented the Titan internal documents. The planning survey dated 14 years ago, the geological assessment, the map of the basin with the red circle around the Vance property, the notation, priority acquisition, highest probability zone. The quality of the quiet in the courtroom changed. Pellerin was immediately on his feet. The documents were proprietary. Their provenance was unclear. Their authenticity was unestablished. He moved to exclude them. Hargrove looked at the documents. She looked at Oates. Oates addressed authentication for 4 precise minutes. The documents bore Titan's internal formatting and reference numbers. The geological survey they referenced matched Titan's disclosed acquisition activity in the region. 3 individuals named in the documents were currently employed by Titan in senior positions, verifiable through the company's own public filings. Hargrove denied the exclusion motion. She looked at Pellerin with the expression of someone extending a final opportunity to conduct himself sensibly. Pellerin sat down. One of his associates was writing rapidly on a legal pad. Across the gallery, Graydon's carefully maintained neutrality had acquired a new quality, a stillness that was no longer composed but controlled, which were not the same thing. Then Oates turned to Lena again. "Miss Vance, please describe the cassette recorder and tape you found in the footlocker on the property your grandfather left you." Lena stood and described it. The footlocker's contents, the recorder at the bottom beneath the document folders, the tape in its plastic case with Arthur's handwriting on the label. She explained what she had read in the journal about Graydon's 2 visits, the first with the offer, the second with the altered approach, and Arthur's decision after the second visit to maintain the recorder in a state of readiness. She was aware of the gallery behind her, of Corbett's stillness and Arlo's crossed arms, and Prescott and the ranching families listening with the concentrated attention of people for whom this was not abstract. She was aware of Graydon in the front row. She was not nervous. She had expected to be, and she was not. She felt instead the same clarity she had experienced on the first night in the cave, reading Arthur's letter by flashlight. The feeling of being exactly in the place she was supposed to be. "Your Honor," Oates said, "I'd like to play the recording." Pellerin objected on 4 grounds in rapid sequence: authentication, relevance, hearsay, prejudicial effect. Hargrove addressed each in turn with the patience of someone who had already reached a conclusion about their merit. She overruled all 4. Oates set the cassette recorder on the evidence table. She pressed play. A moment of tape hiss. The ambient acoustic of an outdoor space. Wind movement. The sound of a door. Then voices. Arthur's voice first, older and somewhat rough in the way of age, but clear and entirely steady. He was offering coffee. The refusal was polite in a younger man's voice, smooth and practiced at managing the atmosphere of a room. The conversation moved through pleasantries quickly and past them. Graydon's voice on the tape had a different quality from the voice he had used at the property with Lena. The smoothness was present but thinner, and beneath it was something more direct and considerably less pleasant. He talked about the property's remoteness. He talked about the practical challenges facing an elderly man living alone without reliable income or family support nearby. He mentioned, with the specific casualness of something calculated to arrive without looking calculated, that the County Building Assessment Office had been receiving complaints about structures in the area that might not meet current code. Arthur's voice asked what the company's actual interest in the property was. Graydon's voice said Titan was interested in regional development and land consolidation for future infrastructure. Arthur's voice said he'd been told that on the first visit and would appreciate a more specific answer. A pause on the tape. The pause of a decision being made. Then Graydon's voice, the smoothness now largely absent, said that the property sat over a geological feature of significant interest to Titan's long-term operations in the basin. He said the company had been patient. He said patience had limits. He said that an old man living alone in a remote location, without family or local support, was in a vulnerable position that the company would prefer not to have to take advantage of. But that business considerations sometimes require difficult decisions. He said that accidents happened in remote areas. He said he hoped it would not come to that. Arthur's voice, absolutely steady throughout, said he understood perfectly. Graydon's voice said he was glad they understood each other, and that the offer of $50,000 remained open for 30 days, after which Titan would need to pursue other options. A door, footsteps on gravel, ambient sound, wind, and then Arthur's voice alone, close to the recorder, speaking quietly and with great precision. Graydon. Titan Industries. Threat implicit. Direct reference to water rights and basin geological feature. Date and time recorded at the top of the tape. Stored with the documentation. Lena will know what to do with it. Oates clicked off the recorder. The courtroom was absolutely silent. Lena was looking at Graydon. His face had not come apart. He was too experienced for that. But the composition of it had changed. The careful neutrality replaced by something tighter, a rigidity that required visible effort to sustain. He was looking at the recorder on the evidence table with the expression of a man hearing his own voice say, the thing he had calculated could never be proven. Judge Hargrove was writing notes. She wrote for nearly a full minute without looking up. Pellerin was in quiet, rapid consultation with his associates. One associate had a phone with a hand cupped over the mouthpiece. Then Oates placed the last document on the table. She had held it for this moment after the tape because she understood sequencing the way Arthur had understood it. She explained what it was. The internal Titan planning document dated 14 years ago, the one with the red circle around the Vance property. The document that proved Titan had possessed specific geological knowledge about the aquifer system before Arthur had begun his own surveys, had identified the Vance property as the highest probability access point, and had structured their entire acquisition strategy around that concealed knowledge. She pointed to the notation, priority acquisition, highest probability zone. She said, Titan Industries has maintained throughout this proceeding and in all prior communications with both Arthur Vance and Lena Vance that their interest in this property was general and speculative in nature. This document demonstrates that their interest was specific, was grounded in proprietary geological knowledge, and was deliberately concealed from the property owner during every negotiation. The adverse water claim filed 13 years ago was filed against an owner who was being denied the information that would have allowed him to understand what he was protecting. A claim filed in bad faith, based on information systematically withheld from the party with primary rights, cannot establish legal priority under Oregon water law. We ask this court to void Titan's adverse water claim in its entirety and affirm the Vance Estate's exclusive water rights on the subject parcel. She sat down. Pellerin requested a recess. Hargrove granted 15 minutes. During the recess, Lena sat at the council table and did not turn to look at the gallery, though she was aware of it behind her. The contained watchfulness of 40 people who had driven 40 miles on a Tuesday morning to sit in wooden-seated chairs and observe something that mattered to them personally and genuinely. She looked at the windows and the pale November sky above the street. Oates sat beside her and said nothing. She had done what she came to do, and she understood, as experienced people do, when a moment requires stillness. When the recess ended, Pellerin delivered Titan's response, which was shorter than his opening and had a different quality, more oriented toward procedure and delay than toward winning the present argument. He requested continuance for additional discovery. He argued the tape required independent authentication. He argued the provenance of the internal document remained legally problematic. Hargrove listened to all of it. Then she asked Pellerin one question. Had Titan Industries disclosed to Arthur Vance or to Lena Vance, at any point during any negotiation, that the company possessed geological information indicating the presence of a significant aquifer system beneath the subject property? Pellerin said that disclosure obligations in property negotiations were subject to specific legal standards. Hargrove said she understood that and asked him to answer the question. A pause. No, Pellerin said. There was no such disclosure. Hargrove wrote something. She looked up. She voided the adverse water claim. She found that the claim had been filed against an owner who was being denied material information directly relevant to understanding what he held, that the concealment had been deliberate and sustained over many years, and that a claim filed in these conditions could not establish legal priority under Oregon water law. She affirmed the Vance Estate's exclusive water rights on the subject parcel. She noted for the record that statements on the audio recording introduced in evidence potentially implicated provisions of Oregon criminal statutes concerning criminal threatening, and she was referring the matter to the county prosecutor's office for review. She closed the hearing. The sound from the gallery was not loud. It was the sound of people who are not accustomed to making noise in courtrooms, but cannot contain everything. A release of held breath, a low collective murmur, one person's hand finding another person's shoulder. Corbett in the second row uncrossed his arms for the first time since the hearing began and put his hands flat on his knees and looked at the ceiling for a long moment. Lena sat very still at the council table. She heard Graydon leave. She didn't turn to watch. She heard the courtroom door open and close, and after that, the atmosphere of the room changed. The specific atmospheric shift that occurs when a pressure system passes through and the air behind it settles into something that can breathe normally. Oates placed a hand briefly on Lena's arm. "Your grandfather built a very strong case," she said. "He had a long time to work on it," Lena said. Outside the courthouse, the November air was cold and very clear. The mountains to the north showed their new snow in the mid-morning light, the peaks white against a sky blue enough to seem implausible. Corbett was there on the steps, and Arlo and Della, and Prescott and his wife and the ranching families, all of them standing in the cold with the particular expression of people who have watched something restore a thing they hadn't been entirely certain was restorable. Prescott shook Lena's hand and held it for a moment. "That spring," he said, "if it is what the surveys say it is, it could change what is possible out here, for all of us." "I know," Lena said. "I've read the reports." "What are you going to do with it?" She had been thinking about this for 3 weeks, since the early conversations with Oates about the range of outcomes and what they would each mean practically. "I'm not going to sell," she said. "I'm going to lease access to the people who actually live here and work this land. Fair price, conservation terms, no corporate buyers." She paused. "My grandfather spent 10 years protecting it. It should go to people who understand what protecting something actually costs." Prescott looked at her for a moment with the weight of someone who has thought about water in this country his entire life and is now thinking about it differently. Then he nodded slowly. The months that followed had the quality of work that has found its purpose. The cabin was finished by December, completed by Arlo and his cousin on a cold, clear day when the ground was frozen solid and everyone's breath steamed in the air. Lena had been sleeping in the repaired cabin for 3 weeks by then, had grown into the sounds of the property at night, the wind off the desert, the small movements of animals in the juniper scrub, the absolute darkness on moonless nights that was different from any darkness she had known before. She went into the cave nearly every day, learning it the way Arthur had learned it, chamber by chamber, feature by feature, with his journals as her guide. She followed his mapped routes through the system, taking her own measurements and comparing them to his records from years ago, understanding the spring not as a geological abstraction, but as a specific physical reality. The sound it made deep in the rock at the level below hearing, the temperature of the water where it seeped through a crack in the third chamber wall, the way mineral deposits had built up over decades into formations that the flashlight turned unexpected colors. She found the carved wall in the deepest chamber of the secondary system on a Thursday afternoon in late November, 6 weeks after the hearing. She had been working through the secondary chambers Arthur had mapped, the ones she hadn't reached in her initial explorations. The second secondary chamber was small and low-ceilinged, and she had to move slowly, her flashlight sweeping the walls methodically, following Arthur's map with precision. The wall was in the far corner, partially concealed behind a natural stone column that had formed over centuries where 2 formations had grown toward each other and finally met. She would have missed it if she hadn't been following the map closely. If Arthur hadn't marked this chamber with a notation she'd initially read as a survey reference, L here, it was not a survey reference. He had carved their names into the basalt, with something sharp, with patience, with the care of someone doing something that mattered entirely independent of whether anyone would ever see it. Arthur Vance. And below it, Lena Vance. And below the names, a date, her birthday. The date she was born in the year before her parents died, before any of this had happened, before everything. Beside the names, in a section of wall Arthur had prepared deliberately, sanded smooth with something abrasive, was a small rectangular recess cut into the rock. Shallow, carefully made. Empty. Not a place to hide something. A place to be. She stood in front of the carved names for a long time, with her flashlight on the letters, and thought about a man who had come to this chamber alone, in the cold and the dark, and cut his granddaughter's name into solid basalt because there was no other place available to him. Because the world had taken her somewhere he could not follow, and so he had put her in the deepest and most permanent place he had access to. She understood the third key. It was not a key to anything that locked. It was the answer to the question she had been carrying since she read the letter on the first night, the question of what home was and what it was made of. She had believed at 6 years old, sitting in the back of a car moving away from her grandfather's house, that home was the place you left. She had carried that definition through 12 years in several cities and more offices than she could count. This was not a place she was leaving. This was the place she was. She put her hand flat against the wall, against the carved letters of her name, and felt the cold of the basalt and the particular quality of something that had been here much longer than any of the difficulties that had seemed so permanent from inside them. Then she sat down on the cave floor with her back against the stone column, in the cold and the deep silence, in the place Arthur had made for her when there was nowhere else he could put her. And she stayed there for a while without needing to move or explain anything to anyone. She came out of the cave into the late afternoon. The November light was doing what it does in this part of Oregon, coming in flat from the west and clarifying everything it touched, making the landscape look stripped of anything inessential, showing each juniper and rock formation in its most exact version of itself. The mountains to the north caught it on their snowed peaks and reflected it back pale and precise. The cabin stood solid at the center of the property. New roof, new windows. The porch Arlo had finished the previous week running along the front. A light was on inside, the lamp she left burning when she was in the cave, warm and specific against the early evening. On the table inside, Arthur's journals were stacked beside the footlocker, and on the wall she had hung the wedding photograph from the waterproof bag, her parents young and bright-eyed in their best clothes. She sat down on the porch step. The legal agreement with the Valley Water Consortium had been signed 2 weeks after the hearing. 7 ranching families, including Prescott, whose operation was the largest and whose wells had been dropping at a rate that had interrupted his sleep for years. The terms were what she had described on the courthouse steps: fair price, strict conservation limits, annual review, no permanent transfer of rights. The income from the lease was enough, not extravagant, enough to maintain the property and cover Oates's ongoing legal work and keep herself in a life that felt built rather than borrowed. Oates had told her the week before that the county prosecutor's office had opened a formal inquiry based on the court's referral, that Graydon had retained personal legal counsel separate from Titan's, which Oates said was a meaningful indicator of how seriously he was taking the threat, that the state attorney general's office had requested Titan's acquisition records for Harney County going back 20 years, that there were 2 families in the valley who had sold to Titan years ago under circumstances that, in the light of what the hearing had revealed, were beginning to look considerably different than they had at the time. Lena had listened to all of it and felt something that was not exactly satisfaction and not exactly relief, but something between them, something closer to recognition. The feeling of a mechanism functioning the way it was designed to function. Arthur had not built his case primarily to harm Titan or Graydon, though the harm was the natural consequence of what they had done. He had built it to protect the water. The legal consequences were working their way through a system that was slower than the people who had tried to exploit it, but was, in the end, more patient than they had accounted for. Patient money isn't speculative money. Patient money is strategic. He had understood that more completely than they ever had. She thought about him sitting on this same step, on this same porch, looking out at this same property in the same light. 12 years of evenings, 12 years of coming out after the work in the cave was done and sitting here and watching the sky go through its colors, while somewhere in the system, in a place he could not contact and could not see, a girl grew up in ways he couldn't know and had to trust regardless. She pulled the journal from her jacket pocket. She had been carrying it with her for weeks, reading it in sections, not hurrying. She had saved the last entry. She had been saving it the way you save the last page of something important, because once you read it, the reading is over and you have to live with what you know. She opened it to the final page. Arthur's handwriting here was the most effortful in the entire journal, the letters larger and pressed harder, made with the care of someone who needed to be certain they would be legible. But they were entirely legible. He had made sure. Lena, he had written, if you found the chamber, if you saw the wall, then you know what this was always about. Not the water, though the water is real and it matters, and I hope it serves people well for a very long time. Not the legal case, though I worked hard to make it strong. It was always about having a place to put you when the world wouldn't let me keep you near me. I have talked to you in that cave for 12 years, told you things I had no other way to say. I don't know if any of that reached you. I suppose it doesn't matter whether it did or didn't. It was what I had and I used it. I hope the light is good where you're sitting when you read this. It is very good here in the evenings. I have always liked the way it comes in flat from the west this time of year. It makes everything look precisely as important as it is, and nothing more. You are going to be fine, Lena. You were always going to be fine. You got on the bus. All my love, your grandfather, Arthur. She closed the journal. The light on the property was exactly as he had described it, flat and western and golden and very clear, making everything look exactly as important as it was and nothing beyond that. The mountains held the last of it on their snowed peaks. The junipers threw their long shadows east across the pale ground. The rock wall behind the cabin rose up pale and permanent against the early darkening sky, sheltering as it had always sheltered the thing underneath that nobody had known to look for except a stubborn old man who had decided that some things were worth a decade of solitary work, even when you could never tell anyone why. She held the journal in her lap with both hands and looked out at the property and said very quietly to no one and entirely to him, "The light is good." The stars began appearing, one at a time and then suddenly all at once. The same enormous unobstructed sky that had been here before the cabin, and before Arthur, and before any of the difficulties that had seemed so permanent from inside them. She sat on the step and watched them fill in, and thought about 12 years of evenings this man had sat here in this same spot, keeping faith with something he could not see, building toward a morning he didn't know whether he would live to witness. She was the morning he had been building toward. She stayed on the porch until the cold drove her inside. Then she went into the warm cabin with its solid floor and its new windows and its lamp burning on the table beside the footlocker and the stacked journals and the photograph of her parents young and unaware of what was coming. She set Arthur's journal down with the others, carefully, spine up, the way you set down something you are going to want to pick up again. She put more wood in the small stove in the corner. She stood and listened to it catch and felt the warmth begin to build in the room. Outside, under the enormous Oregon sky, the spring moved on through the rock beneath her feet, cold and clean and consistent, as it had moved for longer than anyone had been here to register it, as it would continue long after every difficulty that had visited this small piece of ground was finished and forgotten. Patient the way that water is patient, which is the most patient thing in the world, finding its way through stone by simply continuing, simply persisting, simply refusing to stop being what it was. Lena stood by the stove and felt the warmth building around her and thought about tomorrow. There was work to do. There was always work to do. That was not a burden. That was the shape of a life that had something to build toward. And she had learned in 41 days on this property what 12 years in the system had not been positioned to teach her, that the work itself was the point, that the building was the inheritance, that home was not a place you received but a place you made, day after day with your hands and your attention and your refusal to release what mattered. Arthur had known that. He had tried to give it to her before she was old enough to receive it. He had spent 12 years constructing the conditions for her to learn it herself, on her own terms, in her own time. She understood now why he hadn't chased the car. Chasing was not what was needed. What was needed was staying and working and keeping faith across 12 years that she would eventually come back, and making certain that when she did, there would be something here worth coming back to. She had come back. There was something here. She turned off the lamp. She lay down on the cot in the dark and listened to the stove working and the wind outside, in the deep, complete silence of the eastern Oregon night pressing gently against the walls of the cabin Arthur built. And she slept the way people sleep when they are finally in the right place, without resistance, without listening for trouble, with the particular ease of someone who has, after a very long time, arrived somewhere that was always theirs.